All right, enough ragging on other people's reading choices. Let's talk about my failures as a reader for a change. Going to talk today about some books I literally haven't read. It's going to be about, 10-ish books. But these are all specifically books I haven't read that are like DNF, do not finish, that have defeated me in other terms. Starting off, I think this is pretty typical maybe of a lot of people that watch this channel. Finnegans Wake by James Joyce. I made my first attempt at reading this, my first and only attempt at like reading the whole thing through in, I believe, 2017 was the year. And I don't know what you were doing in 2017, but there are a lot of things that were distracting me in the world, and I didn't really feel like I could ultimately give this book my attention. I did make it through like part one, like I read through 180 pages, right? Kind of did the typical thing, didn't necessarily understand most of what I was reading. I will say that after that first chapter I think is maybe the hardest, kind of most opaque toward meaning, or maybe most multitudinous in its meaning, to put it another way. But the reading got significantly easier, which I'll still say probably wasn't getting over 50% of what I was reading at the time. And just, it's a book that I think really demands your whole seriousness, and I wasn't ready to give it that. One of the things, when we talk about Finnegans Wake, we always talk about what's the book that you're reading alongside it to make sense of it. And I had asked for this book, the Roland McHugh Annotations. Is it just called? Yeah, Annotations to Finnegans Wake. And this was kind of recommended to me as the best annotation, the best guide for reading through Finnegans Wake the first time. Problem is this, so you'll be able to kind of see, it's just kind of a random page, and you see all that text. The text is placed like in place to match sort of the text in the regular book. The problem is this edition does not match these annotations. So that was another thing that kind of kept me from reading it at the time. This has been kind of a holy grail book. It's definitely like top on my gotta read this before I die. And yet, look at how cavalier I am with just skipping it year after year. I first became aware of this book. I don't know if I've told this story before, but I first became aware of this book in high school, actually. My English teacher, the first day of high school, he got out this book, and I believe Beowulf in the original Old English. And, he did something like, does anyone want to have a free 100 on a test? Does anyone want to make $20 today? Okay, read a page of this and tell me what it says. So, of course, none of us could read Old English. None of us could make sense of Finnegans Wake. But he kind of used that as like a sort of jumping off point of, this is both like what English literature has been, but also sort of what it can become and how sort of crazy and expansive it can actually be. We only ever read Dubliners like in the class, but he used it. He also pulled out Ulysses, I believe, like on the same day, and read from the Penelope, the last chapter of it. So it's always stuck with me. It stuck with me so much that when I was a teacher in a former life, for the 1 year that I did that, I basically did the same routine on my first day. And I don't know if I really did it for any more reason than to just do a literary flex on the kids. And most of them didn't even ask whether I'd read the whole book or not. Some of them did, and I had to admit, no, I've just read portions of it. So this next one, and I have a couple books like this that are more sort of reference books that I'll be talking about, but this is the Bill James Historical Baseball Abstract the revised, I believe the 2001 edition. And this is is it 13, 14? No, it's only 1,000 pages. It's about 1,000 pages. Trying to boost my numbers there of what I haven't read. And Bill James is like kind of the godfather of sabermetrics in baseball. Like without Bill James, he's like referenced in the movie Moneyball and in the book. And a lot of what he did in this book went on to affect or change how players were evaluated. And so it really is like an entire history of baseball. And it goes through kind of decade by decade, and it goes through sort of leagues by leagues. It'll talk not just about the major leagues, but also a pretty extensive overview of the Negro leagues, and also like some pretty extensive overviews of some minor leagues that or some sort of semi-pro leagues that eventually got subsumed into the MLB as the minor league systems. So kind of the first several hundred pages of the book are just about the history, and it's going through maybe decade by decade, and just giving broad overviews of everything. And then like most of the rest of the book is player ratings, and this is where stuff like WAR, wins above replacement, or win shares, this was kind of the proto metric for that. And so he goes through and he basically kind of gives a definitive listing of, according to my math, these players are the best. And so it's a book that's really easy to just kind of pick through and read a little bit at a time. But I have not gotten through, and I don't know if I'll ever get through quite all of it. It's one of those books that's even hard to remember exactly what you've read before. Another reference book. This is always another fun one to really flip through. This is Last Words of Notable People. Yeah, just notable people, by William B. Brahms. And I became aware of this book through the Vlogbrothers of kind of all things. In fact, this was, I think, like John Green famously, his first book was Looking for Alaska, and that kid in that book is like obsessed with the last words of famous people. So this book, I think, was written around the same time or concurrently, or maybe like just after. And so that's how I kind of found out about it. I think John Green either knows this author or was just very aware of the book and, was a big fan of it. I'll read through a couple of my favorite kind of last words of at least a couple writers. So like James Joyce, for instance, he has disputed different last words. The number one is does nobody understand, which I definitely think is a lot more apocryphal. I wouldn't guess that these were actually kind of words that he says, but they are kind of good words to maybe encompass where he was at, especially with the confused reception of Finnegans Wake as it was. So a lot of the words in here are apocryphal. They're like believed. Sometimes they write down like literally what their last written words were and then what their last reported spoken words were. The other reported last word of James Joyce's was, "A good omen. I like Neuchâtel wine." And this was his response when he learned he was receiving a blood transfusion from 2 soldiers in Neuchâtel, Switzerland. Nikolai Gogol, I think, has some interesting last words. Again, another disputed guy. 3 different quotes. So here's the first one. "And I shall laugh a bitter laugh," which is a quote from the Old Testament. Number 2, "Go on, rise up, charge the mill," which is spoken while delirious, which, again, sounds a little too much, sounds a little too apocryphal, sounds a little too like Don Quixote or Cervantes from my untrained ear. So it's almost like they're trying, right? It kind of sounds like they're trying to, he's doing the Cervantes thing. I don't know. And then number 3, if people knew how pleasant it was to die, they would not fear death. James Baldwin's last words were, "I'm bored." And one of my favorites, Kierkegaard, his last words were a response when asked whether his life turned out as he wanted. He lost the ability to speak soon afterward, lingered 2 weeks before he died. And his last words were this: "Yes, that is why I am very happy and very sad that I cannot share this happiness with anyone." Another book that's kind of a reference book, sort of, that I haven't read, the novel An Alternative History by Stephen Moore. This is part 1, Beginnings to 1600. I do not even have a copy of 16 to 1800. That's part 2, and I believe that one is like 1,000 pages, and this one's barely even 700. But yeah, I got about halfway through, and unfortunately, you might be able to see there, I made good wear on the spine. But this is just a great book that gives overviews of kind of what the novel has been since ancient times. Two of the more interesting because they're just, so kind of not well known. But the two interesting periods that kind of have stuck with me in the years since are like the ancient Egyptian literature and medieval Irish novels, medieval Irish literature. With the ancient Egyptian literature, it's really interesting because there's like a 600-year period that's just like a dark age. And it's like the centuries leading up to and maybe a little after like the Bronze Age collapse. So it makes sense. Maybe a lot of the stuff was probably destroyed at the time. But on either side, they have all this imaginative epic quest and magical realism type of literature that, literally includes space adventures and, body innuendos that are like borderline porn or erotica. And I assume they were all like initially written in the hieroglyphics. So I think that's an interesting translation job that the Egyptologists had on their hands. The other stuff that was really interesting, I was kind of flipping through this last night, and I stumbled upon again the medieval Irish literature, and when I was reading it, I initially expected that it was, this was where I had found out about the Eimar O'Duffy's trilogy, King Ghost, Hawk and the Birds, Spacious Adventures of Man in the Street, and the third book is called Asses and Clover. That's like a 20th century trilogy of novels. The first one, at least, is like a dystopia that kind of revives the old Irish mythological heroes, guys like Cuchulainn, who's kind of considered the Irish Achilles, and Finn McCool, who's like the Irish King Arthur. And one of the things in Irish literature that's been consistent throughout their whole history is that the sort of telling of the tale is as important as the content of the tale is. And so, the Irish have always made an overt show of telling and using the richest language possible. And that was something that kind of proved the storyteller's worth. I think I've talked about this one a couple of years ago. This is King Ghost Hawk. This is the first in the trilogy. And then I actually have the others. Here's Spacious Adventures of Man in the Street, and then those were the two reprints by Dalkey Archive, American reprints, and then Asses and Clover was the third one, didn't even get a reprint in the Dalkey Archive. I will shout out, I did read recently I think it was Chad Post's newsletter where he did like a whole summation of this trilogy. And if you're not subscribed to the newsletter and you like newsletters about literature, especially about Dalkey Archive, Chad Post recently did like a 5-part, and he has really long like newsletters, so they're longer reads, but he did like a 5-part history on Dalkey Archive. So I'll include a link to that down below if I remember to do it. Another book that I haven't read, and you'll notice a conspicuous missing gnome that usually sits right on here. He's away right now. He's on vacation, but also that means I can talk about books of his that I didn't read. This one's On Language by Noam Chomsky, and this book in particular is actually 2 different books from the 70s of Noam Chomsky's. The first one was 1979, Language and Responsibility. The other one is Reflections on Language, 1975. And each of these books has kind of two different parts in it. I've read, I don't know, probably like half the essays in here. One of like my weaknesses, I feel like in my reading life, is that I'm not more into like linguistics and the actual technical aspects maybe of language and language arts. It's always been on the periphery of my interests, but I've never fully delved in. I feel it's vaguely analogous to like physics or engineering. I want it explained to me in a narrative. I'm not necessarily interested in acquiring like the skill to understand the sequences and the puzzles of everything that it is. The book is a combination of like lectures and also just like kind of question and answer interviews. He uses that format a lot in a lot of his nonfiction. It's basically a book full of recorded podcasts or of transcripts of podcasts. And I personally wish more nonfiction kind of used, especially that Q&A format. Lectures, like we already have essays. Those are just essays. But I think this is some of the more accessible sort of introductory Chomsky that gives you a good overview, not just of like his politics, but also especially of his linguistic and professional work. I will be honest, the more it gets into specifically like linguistic stuff, the less I tended to be interested or be able to read. But he doesn't just stay narrowly on those two topics. He goes through a whole wide range of things, from like human nature, epistemology, empiricism, rationalism, and just sort of human knowledge and inquiry writ large. Okay, here's a much shorter one than the ones I've been showing off. Book I have not read by a guy that I really like, for other reasons than his writing, is Tarantula by Bob Dylan. If you don't know, this was a book, I think he started writing as early as like 65 or 66. And it eventually came out in the early 70s after a lot of delays. And it's a book just sort of full of like beat style poetry, kind of. It's sort of, it veers wildly. It's very tough to read, I think, because it veers wildly between like almost a parody of like kind of beat avant-garde poetry and like an earnest attempt at it. And it doesn't feel all that serious. It feels like a project that he started and then abandoned, and they were like, hey, you still have this contract, we need to get something out. There were a lot of things that Bob Dylan talked about wanting to do in that time. I don't know if he was talking about doing like an opera or a musical, but there are a number of things that he didn't finish in pursuit of other things. If you're gonna read like some actual Bob Dylan in his own words, a book that I have actually read that I would highly recommend is The Essential Interviews of Bob Dylan. This is Dylan kind of in his own words, and you can see how he constantly, just plays games with a lot of his interviewers. He's never really wanting to bring kind of the real Dylan forward. Does the real Dylan even exist? But his style in terms of just always sort of eliding or avoiding or answering things in his own way is a much better poetry than whatever is in Tarantula. I'm still going to try and read through Tarantula, and there, occasionally you come across kind of fun little bits that remind you, oh yeah, this guy is like an actual poet and he's interesting and really good, but it's not necessarily on the top of my list. I have ambitions to like read some more Bob Dylan and kind of do a whole long video about maybe like his essential writings, and then maybe also something about his movies. I saw the recent movie recently, and it was fine. It was a good normie introduction, I think, to Bob Dylan. The good one, go check out I'm Not There. That's one of my favorite movies of all time. It's great. It's amazing. This next book is actually two books. These are two of the big short story collections by Donald Barthelme. There's 60 stories, and there's 40 stories. These are kind of the collected works of basically his most famous stories, and I've never finished like either one, but I've probably read about 40 stories out of each of them. Not out of each of them, out of them combined. And like Barthelme's an interesting guy because like the stuff that I really like by him, and I get the sense that a lot of Barthelme readers are like this. There's the portion of Barthelme that you think is like really good and fun and maybe borderline genius or whatever. And then there's the other stuff that you're just like, yeah, this is nothing for me. I can't this is a 5-page story and I read the first page and I'm out. So I'm going to flip to the next one. But some of my favorite short stories of all time are written by Barthelme. Probably my favorites, I would say, On Angels, Concerning the Bodyguard, Cortes and Montezuma, The Balloon, and The School. But there's tons more that are really good. I think you can find all 5 of those online for free if you just do a bit of Googling. Finally on my list, and this is, I believe, the longest on my list, and this is also the biggest failure, because I had one goal going into this last year, and I was going to finish this book, and I got 600 pages in, and I was like, I'm halfway through, I'm bored, I'm done. Isn't that just how it goes sometimes? It's not a poorly written book. It's like it does remind me, Divine Days by Leon Forrest. It does remind me, when I was talking earlier about Irish lit, like the medieval Irish lit, and how through present day, like, you know, as much the thing that matters is sort of the telling and the grandness of the storyteller, as much as the tale itself. This feels like, you know, kind of a similar thing going on. It's an 1,135-page book. It's meant to be long. It's meant to be, you know, exuberant in all its length. There is a huge Simpsons level like universe to keep track of, and that was one of the things I started this book. I got about 500 pages in. I was like, okay, I'm starting to slow down just in reading in general. I need to go back and read some shorter stuff, and then I'll come back to this. Came back to it, read another 100 pages, and was like, the joy's not there. The spark's not there. So, you know, it's reading. You can just do what you want. And that's the decision I made. I did really like the underlying story that the main character, Joubert Jones, was kind of tracking down between Sugar Groove, who is kind of like an honest scammer or an honest hustler, and then there's the guy, the recently disappeared kind of pastor cult leader named W.A.D. Ford, and he's like the religious huckster. And so they're both kind of the two sides of the coin of the same archetype. And those were the two poles and pillars of the book that it felt like. But we often get very far away from those stories and into some other corner of his world. And I didn't do as good a job staying engaged as I think the book demanded of me. I did read like the first 10 chapters. There's only 15 chapters in here, and I read 10 of them. But the last 5 chapters are just half of the book. I don't know if I'm going to get back into reading it. We'll see. I just feel like I read enough to where I didn't necessarily want to explore it more. And I wanted to prioritize some different, longer things. And that will serve as my teaser into the next video, because I will be talking about some things that I will be reading, that I have read, that I hope to read, as well as just some new books that I have accrued in my next video. So please stay tuned. That will probably come out in a couple days. And thank you for watching. And thank you for keeping me humble.